Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I'm here today to announce a very special reading event framed in September, which is a month devoted to thinking about art in all its forms, from reading fiction or nonfiction to perhaps going to a museum or gallery or performance, and possibly even trying your hand at creating art. My wonderful co-hosts for this event are Elisabeth at the channel Bookwins and Books, who first came up with the idea for this reading event, Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads, and BookTube's own resident art expert, Heather at Heather Gregg, an amazing group. We would love for you to participate with us in whatever way makes sense for you. The suggested prompts we have are quite simple. Let me list them out for you. First, read a book about art, either fiction or nonfiction. Second, think about a way you could experience art, whether it's visiting a museum or gallery, or going to a concert or dance performance, or spending a few minutes thinking about the architecture of your neighborhood, or even a picture hanging in your own house. Third, as a bonus prompt, create art, or tell us about a work of art that has special meaning to you. When the host and I first talked about what the prompts might be, we had a fascinating discussion about what exactly art means. Of course, you yourself can decide what you're going to include as, quote, art. Personally, I would include not just visual arts like painting and sculpture, but also everything from music to photography, from film to dance. In fact, if you're interested, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you define not only what qualifies as art, but also what the meaning and purpose of art is. Right at the moment, I'm thinking a lot about craft. Not only the crafting I do myself when I'm knitting holiday presents, but much more skilled craft that's often displayed in museums. Is that art? If so, why and how do we differentiate it from other art? As I said, one of the challenges is to experience art, to visit a museum or gallery or other place where you can appreciate art, even if it's in your own backyard or your bedroom. Personally, I'm hoping to visit a few museums in the DC area, and I'll try to take you along with me for some of my adventures. But reading is also clearly a big part of the BookTube event. As regular viewers will know, I've been making monthly lists of forthcoming books this year, and I've been a bit startled by how many of them are about art. I thought today I would try to recap some of these artsy titles that made it onto my lists and that still intrigue me. Here are a dozen ideas to add to your TBR, all published in 2025. Perhaps one of the most obvious books for Framed 2025 is the new Adventures in the Louvre, How to Fall in Love with the World's Greatest Museums by Elaine Sciolino, where the author shares her own love of Paris's tremendous museum, full of some of the most astounding masterpieces in the art world. She tours us around the galleries and gardens and backstage areas in order to introduce us not only to a great variety of artworks, but also to a great variety of people who work in the museum, including curators and the artisans who make the frames for the art, etc. This sounds just perfect for the Art Readathon. Another book that came out earlier this year is a new biography by Blake Gobnick called The Mavericks Museum, Albert Barnes and His American Dream. Albert Barnes, the man who created the Barnes Art Collection in Philadelphia, had a very different approach from most of the curators of art museums. Although Barnes was not raised in an aristocratic family, he acquired an enormous fortune while working in medical development during the Progressive Era. With that money, he decided to invest in art. Specifically, he was interested in the work of Renoir, Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, etc., artists who were not yet being actively collected for display in the world's art museums. And he was interested in sharing his collection with people who often did not visit art museums, the working class people he grew up with, who did not necessarily have much experience with or knowledge of art history. So instead of trying to display the art in a way that would highlight particular movements throughout time and place, Barnes became more interested in focusing on the actual use of imagery and symbols, etc. Last year, I visited the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia and made a vlog where I talked about the issue. I'll leave a link to it down in the comments. A very different kind of book is Where the Old Roses Grow, Vita, Sackville-West, and the Battle for Beauty During Wartime by Janelle McCulloch. This is a short little book that will appeal to the garden lovers among us, but also intrigue readers more drawn to history and aesthetics. Sackville-West is considering the place of traditional roses in British history, and she's interested in preserving that national legacy that she sees rooted in an appreciation of beauty. That might sound obvious, but she was writing at a time when a lot of people were pulling up their ornamental gardens during and after World War II in order to grow food at a time when people were going hungry. That issue of privileging beauty in the face of the crisis should make for a really interesting read. Another 2025 release focused on art is Twilight in Bohemia, Westbeth and the Last Artist of New York by Peter Trachtenberg. In 1970 or so, artists and their families could get affordable housing at Westbeth Artist Housing, a location in what was then a relatively undesirable area of New York City. The collective filled the entire city block and housed everyone from the photographer Diane Arbus to musician Phil Evans. The pub sheet says that Westbeth served as a, quote, great society for Bohemians. Great society in capital letters, as it was used by President Johnson in the 1960s, and explains that offering artists basically a middle-class life at affordable rents made it possible for them to do their work. Over time, the neighborhood not surprisingly gentrified and became a much sought-after neighborhood for the wealthy, now with almost all of its residents over about the age of 60, making it, as the pub sheets points out, an artsy senior center, in a way. Sounds like fun. Another 2025 art book is Liza Bennet's Georgia and Anita, the lifelong friendship of George O'Keeffe and Anita Pollitzer. This is the story of two women that had a tremendous impact on 20th century America in general. Pollitzer was the first person to show George O'Keeffe's artwork to the famous photographer Alfred Stieglitz, who became a central figure in O'Keeffe's life as well as in the modern art world. Pollitzer herself became a leader in the National Women's Party and an advocate for the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. This biography of the friendship between the two women is based on the correspondence between them, 50 years worth of letters. These are two people who played important roles, very different roles, in the coming of modernism. One in the art world and one in social and political life. Their friendship sounds like a fascinating lens into their experience. A bit different is the essay collection by the novelist Richard Russo, Life and Art. This collection considers how these two concepts, life and art, inform each other as we try to understand the world around us. Russo was interested in how people think about what they know, and what they don't know, and what they can't know, as well as why we feel compelled to tell stories. All of that sounds very abstract and non-specific, but the essays are really quite personal, at least from what I've had a chance to read so far. What feels most significant in the book is Russo's contemplation about how past experiences, especially our untold stories, as I think he calls them, makes us into who we think we are, and how that motivates the art we do, including the writing we do. Okay, how about another biography? Let's talk about Wild Thing, A Life of Paul Gauguin by Sue Prideaux, a new biography of the French post-impressionist artist and his reputation as a transgressive genius, a reputation that developed from both his biography and his unconventional art using imagery of indigenous people and culture, especially from Polynesia. Prideaux argues that Gauguin wasn't nearly as transgressive as his reputation suggested. Based on newly available primary material, the author essentially disproves previous assumptions, like the idea that Gauguin had syphilis. Instead, she suggests that he tried to escape the bustle of Paris for the simple, quiet life in Tahiti. And while he was there, he found himself fighting against French colonialism and for indigenous rights without any original plan to do so. Another book, one I'm hoping to read myself this month, is Art on My Mind, Visual Politics by the incomparable Belle Hooks, published as a special edition honoring the 30th anniversary of the book. I haven't read this volume of hers, but I have loved much of her previous work and find that even years later it still crackles with intelligence and profoundly deep compassion that's usually not in academic writing. Art in My Mind is both true art criticism and also quite personal. It's made up of essays considering the works of Basquiat and Lorna Simpson, Cara Mae Weems and Margot Humphrey, etc. Hooks is interested in how these artists made their art, but also how they were able to sell their work or get it shown in some of the world's greatest museums. She's also interested in the question of how art might function as one part of the struggle for freedom for Black artists and women artists and others. This pairing of questions, how artists have marketed their work and how the same artists have tried to create liberatory work, sounds really fascinating. For those of you more interested in a book using art and artists to shine a light on serious historical issues, you might want to pick up The Painter's Fire, A Forgotten History of the Artist Who Championed the American Revolution by Zara Anishanslin. When I talked about this book before, I quoted from the publicity sheet. The war that we now call the American Revolution was not only fought in the colonies with muskets and bayonets. On both sides of the Atlantic, artists armed with paint, canvas, and wax played an integral role in forging revolutionary ideals. This book looks at 3 lesser-known artists that resisted rule by the monarchy in the colonies by using their art to illuminate American patriotism as well as larger issues of liberty. Let me mention a book not about visual art, but about music. Listen with Father, How I Learned to Love Classical Music by Caroline Sanderson, published by Unbound. The book is a memoir biography about a woman and her father who shared the bond of music. When Caroline was a little girl, her father introduced her to the music of Mozart, and when she was a little older, she fell in love with the popular music of the 1970s and 80s and stayed there, even when her father sometimes tried to steer her back to the classical music world. It was only when he died that she began to listen to classical music seriously again, as a way to connect with her memories of him. She set out a plan to listen closely to the music her father had most loved, and trying to understand why he loved each piece and what she could take from it for herself. Sounds like an interesting braiding of a grief memoir, which I read a lot of, and an overview of music. I'm also interested in reading Grand Finales, The Creative Longevity of Women Artists by Susan Gubar, a feminist literary scholar who has long been widely respected in the field. Roughly 20 years ago, Gubar faced a cancer diagnosis with an expected prognosis of only a few years. She outlived that prognosis, but the experience sparked in her a new question. Essentially, what does creativity look like during the last years of our lives? Here in the book, she spotlights what she calls very creative old ladies, some of whom were writers, while others were painters, musicians, and dancers from a variety of periods. Each of Gubar's chapters focuses on a different artist or writer, including George Eliot, Georgia O'Keeffe, Marianne Moore, Colette, and others. And she makes the argument that partly because older people, especially older women perhaps, are often dismissed The final years of one's life can sometimes spark a new way of thinking about the world and one's place in it. The line I really loved in the publicity sheet, which I hope is Gubar's line, is that these artists wielded a kind of geezer machismo. Perfect. One book I think might make it onto my own pile of possibilities this month is How to Be Avant-Garde, Modern Artist and the Quest to End Art by Morgan Falconer. This is the story of 20th century artists who imagined that they were absolutely transforming art in such a way that art would become the substance of everyday life. The author points out that this change happened after the horrors of World War I, really across the globe, and especially in urban areas. Falconer is an art historian and traces the story from the futurist, the Dadaist, surrealist, constructivist, etc. For those of you who follow my channel closely, you might know that I am reading some modernist literary texts in August. And while I enjoy modernist literature, it's not my favorite literature, not by any means. But modern art, it is my favorite kind of art. Nevertheless, I'm not particularly well versed in art history, so I'm intrigued to read this one. Another book I'm eager to read is The Club, where American women artists found refuge in Belle Epoque Paris by Jennifer DeSalle. Women traveling alone in Paris during this period of relative stability and opulence sometimes stayed at what was called the American Girls Club, a hub for both female expatriates in general, but especially for creative women interested in the fine arts. These artists forged connections with Paris's world of arts and letters, from Gertrude Stein to Rodin. I love when books find ways to talk about a variety of characters, shall we say, without it just seeming like a laundry list of disconnected entries. A hotel, a community of sorts that holds a pretty diverse range of people and rotates who's living there, seems like a great way to approach what was possible in this kind of setting. These women gathered around together, sharing their dedication to art and the life of the mind and social activism, and in the process forged a path for female artists who followed. Well, thank you so much for watching today. I hope you will all join us for this wonderful event. I can't wait to see what books you might put on your TBR or your pile of possibilities, as well as what museums you think you might visit, or any other experiences you might have related to art during the month of September. I'm really looking forward to this month. See you soon on all my co-host channels, as well as here on Hannah's Books.